My name is Joanna Kerr. I'm a librarian at London's Central Library, and we are happy to partner with the Rotman Institute of Philosophy and the Department of Philosophy at Western University to bring you this program series. There is one more session remaining in the series after tonight, happening next Thursday at 7 p.m. To register, go to the Rotman Institute website or check the library's online programming calendar. The chair of tonight's program is Eric Desjardins. Eric is the Associate Director of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy and an Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Western. His research interests include the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of science, and environmental philosophy. Before Eric formally starts our program tonight, we would like to take this time together to acknowledge that we in London, Ontario, are speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Lenape, and neutral peoples. This land is covered by several treaties, including Treaty 6, the London Township Treaty of 1796. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank the generations of peoples who have taken care of this land. Together and going forward, may we recognize our own responsibility in the stewardship of this land. To learn more about Treaty 6, the library holds materials on this and other treaties and land sessions. I'll include these titles in the chat. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to Eric Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for this introduction. And well, thank you for everyone for being there to this third in our series on the moral responsibility to others. Welcome back to those who have attended the first two, and welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. Our speaker tonight is Anthony Skelton, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Western University, so a colleague of mine. He specializes in normative ethics and in the history of ethics, and so he's published numerous articles in very good journals. He's also co-editor of what is probably the best textbook in bioethics in Canada, and the title is Bioethics in Canada. And he's also author of an upcoming book on Sedgwick's ethics. And so if you want to know about who's Sedgwick and his ethics, you would have to ask Anthony here for more information about that. But perhaps that's going to be a topic for another night, because tonight he's going to tell us about the ethics in the time of coronavirus. But before I I let Anthony take the screen here, I would just like to remind you that the way it's going to work is that Anthony is going to give a talk, and then there's going to be a Q&A session. So if you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical questions, then you can use the chat, and we're going to do our best to answer your questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Anthony Skelton.
Thanks. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody who's attending tonight. I appreciate it very much. And also thank you to the Institute and the library for organizing this great series and for inviting me to be part of it. As Eric said, I'm going to be talking this evening about ethics in the time of coronavirus. Of course, there's lots of ethical issues that are raised by our experience during this time, pandemic, and so on. But I'm only going to talk about one particular issue, and that's the issue of whether we ought to mandate vaccination for COVID-19. Okay, so here goes. So as everybody knows, we're of course in the midst of a pandemic. Here in Ontario, more than 100,000 people in Ontario have been infected with COVID-19, and more than 3,400 people have been killed by the virus. Some of those who've been affected but not killed by the virus continue to experience health and other complications. As we all know, public health measures have been put in place to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Those include things like quarantining. So here on the campus, for example, it was announced today that there are some students who are being quarantined because there's been an outbreak in one of the residences. Business and school closures, many of you will have experienced those things. And of course, general lockdowns, including significant limitations on freedom of movement, among other things. Now, of course, if we do find a safe, effective vaccine, it may be permissible to remove some of the public health restrictions currently in place. And there seems to be good news on that vaccine front. Recently, as many of you will have seen from the news reports, 2 pharmaceutical companies have reported that they have developed an effective vaccine for COVID-19. But of course, we have to be cautious about such news reports. This is, of course, good news, but news about which we have to be cautious. The data has not yet been peer-reviewed for these clinical trials that have produced these vaccines, and the safety data has yet to be released. Nevertheless, we may soon have an effective and safe vaccine for COVID-19. Once we have a safe and effective vaccine approved by regulatory agencies, we will need to answer some important ethical questions. So science can tell us what's an effective vaccine, it can tell us what's an effective treatment for COVID-19, but it can't tell us what we ought to do once we have effective treatments and once we have effective vaccines. Then we will have to turn to ethical considerations, and it seems to me that at least to some extent, philosophers like myself, I hope, knock on wood, might have some role to play in helping to answer some of these questions. So one of the questions we're going to face once we have a vaccine and we've been able to distribute it fairly widely is, what's the most equitable way to distribute the vaccine? Another way to put the question is, who should be given priority? So should we give priority to the most vulnerable, for example, older adults, or should we give priority to frontline healthcare workers, or perhaps to children? Okay, so that's an ethical question. Who should be given priority? Ethical question is, what's the best or most equitable way to distribute this medical resource? Once we answer these questions, we will need to answer other questions in addition. So this is the question I'm going to focus on, the second one in this case. So these questions are, should vaccine be left to the voluntary choice of individuals? Should we mandate vaccination for COVID-19? Or maybe should we consider some third option for the promotion of vaccination? Okay. So as we know, we've had these public health measures in place for some time now in Ontario and other parts of Canada, other parts of the world. And those, of course, have imposed significant cost on us, on the most vulnerable, on mental health, and on social well-being generally. Now, of course, those are costs, but those costs are justified by the fact that they prevent still greater costs that might result from allowing COVID-19 to infect people. So we've got these costs due to these public health restrictions. Those costs, those restrictions are justified by the fact that they prevent, hopefully the idea is anyway, they prevent still greater costs through disease spread and death. Okay. So one way we can perhaps find our way out of these public health restrictions and so find our way away from these costs is to find a vaccine. This seems to be really the most promising route to lifting public health restrictions. Now, of course, when we have a vaccine, what we need is not just some people to take it, we need a high percentage of the population to take it because we need to achieve something called herd immunity, the point at which there's really no people or no individuals for the disease, or in this case for COVID-19 to infect. Once we've reached that level, there's nowhere for the disease to go, and so nobody is being, or very few people are being infected. Now, of course, this might be achieved, this herd immunity might be achieved by leaving vaccination up to voluntary choice. But we have some good reasons to think that we should be less than sanguine, that just leaving things up to people's voluntary choice will do the trick. So according to a recent Ipsos poll, only 54% of Canadians would take a vaccine as soon as it is made available. A significant number of Canadians, it seems, from this poll, are willing to wait to be vaccinated. Maybe they want to wait to see what the safety considerations look like. This delay will prevent the achievement of herd immunity and the removal of public health restrictions currently in place. This will cost lives. So might we consider then mandating vaccination to speed things up? According to the Ipsos poll, support amongst Canadians for mandating vaccination is around 61%. It's a number that's pretty high, but it's not that high, and it's been dropping since earlier in the pandemic when other polls were conducted. So then the question is, how might we convince more people to accept mandating vaccination for COVID-19? If we're going to be able to convince people, we need to find an argument that has broad appeal. I'm not sure I've done that, but I'm going to try. But the important thing here is we can't just appeal to any old view or theory. We have to appeal to something that has broad appeal, that will resonate with a broad number of people, because as we know, with any policy, such as a policy mandating vaccination, the people who are affected by it or the people who are covered by it need to be given good reasons to accept it. In order for it to be justified, it needs to have good reasons that are of broad appeal to those who are being affected by it. So what is the most appealing argument for it? So I'm going to look at a few arguments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first start out by looking at a very stark set of positions. Then I'm going to look at some work by my colleagues at Oxford. Then I'm going to look at some work that I did in conjunction with another colleague at Oxford. And then I'll look at some considerations in the law. So here's two stark views, and they represent really two kind of fundamental features or aspects of our moral thinking. So one aspect of our moral thinking, or one way of conceiving of ethics, is around the idea of rights. And in particular, the idea that we all have rights, and that rights are something that each of us has a duty to respect or to regard. One right I think we're all going to agree that we have is the right to bodily integrity, right? A right to what happens in and to your body. If you take this right seriously, then you're going to presumably, or you're likely going to frown upon mandating vaccinations, because mandating vaccination is basically mandating a kind of treatment which involves interfering with bodily integrity. And since interfering with bodily integrity violates a right, you might think if you held the rights view, you would reject a mandating vaccination. So if you were a rights theorist and you took these rights particularly seriously and you thought we had a right to bodily integrity, you would hold the view that mandating vaccination is not acceptable. There's another aspect of our moral thinking, or another way of conceiving what our moral thinking is about, and that focuses not on individual rights, but it focuses on the promotion of social good, or on what's good for the social whole, on social well-being. And on this view, you might think if what matters is good outcomes for the social whole, or for the well-being of society, and mandating vaccination is of the options available to us, the most likely to produce good outcomes, it would be not only permissible, but obligatory to mandate it. Now, of course, these two views are going to conflict. When you set out to promote social good, and that maybe entails that you ought to mandate, you're going to presumably violate certain rights to bodily integrity. At least it seems that way. On the other hand, if you respect people's right to bodily integrity, at least in the way it's conceived on this view that I've been discussing, you're going to fail to or interfere with promoting good outcomes for the social whole. So there's a conflict. There's a conflict between two ways of understanding what ethics is about, two ways of thinking about what we ought or should do. And so what I'm going to ask is there a way for us to in some way find a view that's in the middle of these two positions, that in some way gives some weight to people's rights, but also promotes good outcomes for the whole. I'll just give you a kind of foreshadow what's going to happen. I'm going to err more on the side of the second view than on the first view. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with an argument from my colleagues at Oxford, Tom Douglas, Lisa Forsberg, and Johnny Pugh. They published an article recently in the Journal of Medical Ethics in which they were arguing in favor of mandatory vaccination and also mandatory treatments generally in the context of a pandemic. So part of their argument involves the claim that mandatory vaccination will typically be less harmful than the current public health restrictions. So those limitations on liberty, those limitations on movement, those limitations on association and so on, mandating vaccination or being vaccinated will typically be less harmful than current public health restrictions. So as they note, current public health restrictions have imposed significant cost on us, reduced mental health, restrictions on our liberty, where to go, what to do, whom to see, etc. And they've also increased domestic forms of abuse. So there's been significant costs associated with them. On the other hand, a safe and effective vaccine would impose some risk. No health intervention is 100% safe. But of course, the severe side effects are usually pretty rare. So a safe and effective vaccination would impose some risk, and very severe risks are very, very rare. So they're pretty safe. So they argue if the public health restrictions are justified, so if we're justified in the current set of public health restrictions, which impose significant costs on the grounds that they prevent still greater costs, and the costs associated with vaccination are smaller in nature than the costs associated with these public health restrictions, then it seems that mandatory vaccination is justified. So look, if you accept that the public health restrictions are justified, they argue, and there's a less costly alternative to getting the same ends as the public health restrictions, and mandatory vaccination is one of them, it seems like mandatory vaccination or some mandatory treatment is going to be justified. Okay. So now you might be asking, well, what about consent? Remember, I talked a little bit about that rights view. Look, I have a right to what happens into my body. And look, nothing, in particular, nothing that a physician or a medical expert would do is justified unless they have obtained my consent, my valid consent. Okay. In England, where my colleagues are writing, their regulatory scheme is that for treatment to be lawful, consent is required. So for a physician to lawfully perform treatment, in most cases, on a patient, then the patient's consent is required. Crucial to the argument that Douglas, Forsberg, and Pugh give is that the right to bodily integrity is not stronger than the right to freedom of movement. So they're equally strong rights. So if the right to freedom of movement has a certain threshold for when it can be overridden, the right then to bodily integrity has a similar threshold. So they argue, look, if it's permissible to infringe the latter right, it seems permissible to infringe the former, right? So if it's permissible under the current conditions to infringe the latter right, that means the threshold for overriding it has been met. If the right to bodily integrity has a similar threshold, or even a lower threshold, then it seems permissible to infringe that right too. Of course, on the assumption that the infringement is to justify good outcomes, as I've said, for the social whole. Okay. Now, here are some concerns about their argument. I find their argument quite convincing, but nonetheless, here are some potential worries. So we might wonder whether it really is true that the right to bodily integrity is not more stringent than the right to freedom of movement. You might just think, look, it's a controversial claim to think that the right to bodily integrity is no more stringent than the right to freedom of movement. You might think, look, the right to bodily integrity is of the rights we have, one of the strongest ones, and requires much more to be at stake in order for it to be permissibly infringed than the right to freedom of movement. In any case, this remains a controversial statement. Why I bring this up is that what they try to do is something that I suggested we should do, which is try to find an argument for mandating vaccination, which has broad appeal or a broader appeal than sort of garden variety moral philosophical views. And we might also just think, look, the reason that bodily integrity is so important is there's something special about my body. There's something special about the body that takes an important consideration to be at stake for it to be something that you can interfere with. Much more has to be at stake to interfere with that than, say, my right to freedom of movement. They have some ways of trying to combat this. I'll put those aside for now. Maybe we can take those up when we come to the question period. Okay. In addition, it's not clear, as they assume, that compulsory vaccination would involve only moderate interferences with bodily integrity. So they seem to assume that it might involve just a one-off injection or something fairly straightforward, like might be true of similar kinds of medical interventions. We just don't know at this point whether that's the case. We don't know that it will be true of the COVID-19 vaccination, that it will be or involve moderate interferences. But look, if it does, then I think they're right that it would involve only moderate interferences, and that this would play some role in justifying mandatory vaccination. Okay. So that's the argument from my colleagues Douglas, Forsberg, and Pugh at Oxford University. Now I'm going to move to an argument that I myself and Forsberg put together in the spring, and this focuses on the justification of mandating vaccination for children. So in many jurisdictions, so in Australia, in Italy, in Germany, in some states in the US, there are mandatory schemes for the vaccination of children. Ontario itself has a quasi-mandatory scheme. We have the Immunization of Pupils Act, which says basically if you want to send your child to public school or daycare, you have to have them vaccinated against a series of illnesses. Measles, mumps, rubella is one of them. I call it quasi-mandatory because it's possible for you to be exempt from the requirement on medical reasons or medical grounds, obviously. So if a vaccine is medically contraindicated for you, then obviously you can be exempt from being vaccinated. But there's also sort of religious or philosophical exemptions. Those are not simple to get, but they're not super difficult to get, but they involve a kind of non-voluntary element because you have to go to a public health unit, watch a video and sign some forms and things like that. And obviously if you don't comply with that, then your child won't be able to attend public school or daycare. Okay. Nonetheless, there seems to be some agreement, I think, that mandating the vaccination of children is justified. So of the places where there's mandatory vaccination, it's typically targeted at children, and there seems to be strong belief that mandating the vaccination of children is permissible. So we might think, look, if we can agree on that to some degree, even if it's only a little bit, we might be able to find a more general argument that's similar in structure that would justify a general position or a general view on mandating vaccination, that would justify generally mandating vaccination, not just for children, but for adults. Okay. So here is an argument that we looked at that is in favor of mandating the justification of children. And what we wanted to ask, what Lisa and I wanted to ask, was whether or not we could extract from this argument an argument for vaccination, mandatory vaccination more generally. So here's the argument. If, this might be one of the arguments people give for mandating the vaccination of children, if by vaccinating their children, parents can easily and safely avoid imposing a significant risk of death and suffering on their children, parents ought to vaccinate their children. Vaccinating one's children is an easy and safe way to avoid imposing the risk of death and suffering on their children, at least with respect to the scheme of vaccinations that are typically mandated. Vaccination of those things poses only a very small risk to those who are vaccinated. That's a well-documented scientific fact. The state has an obligation, the argument continues, to protect children from exposure to easily avoidable risk of death and suffering. Therefore, the state ought to mandate that parents vaccinate their children. So this is an argument for mandating the vaccination of children, why parents might be mandated to vaccinate their children against serious diseases that are easily prevented through vaccine. Okay. So now we think, look, maybe the same reasoning might justify a mandatory vaccination scheme for adults generally. Anyone who is not vaccinated poses a risk to others. So not just children who are unvaccinated, right? But anyone who's not vaccinated poses a risk to others, especially to the most vulnerable. people who can't be vaccinated because they have an allergy or because they have a medical condition, people who don't react well to vaccines, whatever the case may be, but especially the most vulnerable. And individuals may easily and without much cost to themselves avoid imposing a significant risk to others by being vaccinated. So we think maybe, perhaps, the state ought to mandate vaccination for them. If the reason for mandating vaccination of children is to protect the vulnerable, right, and adults can, like children, be threats to the vulnerable, we think maybe if you can accept mandatory vaccination in the case of children, why wouldn't you accept it in the case of adults? Okay. So of course, we may not know yet whether it is true that getting the vaccine for coronavirus or COVID-19 will be easy, safe, and undemanding. We just don't know that yet. But if it is safe, easy, and undemanding, you might think there's reason to mandate, right? Maybe even if it's not as powerful a protection as, say, a vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella, right? As long as it gives significant, you might think, and it's safe and easy to get, you might think there's reason to mandate. Now, of course, there are concerns here about bodily integrity too, right? Typically, we think it's permissible to treat children according to what is in their best interests, okay? That's the sort of guiding moral framework that governs them. So you think, look, we should treat children in accordance with their best interests, right? We are less concerned in the case of children with their consent. Now, of course, that changes as they age, but that seems to be the kind of general orientation. With respect to adults, however, we don't typically just treat them according to their best interest. We respect their right to bodily integrity, even when respecting it means they will make a decision which will be disastrous for their health or their well-being. Okay. All right. So here maybe I'm maybe stretching, but thinking that maybe there's some support for the idea that in this kind of case, we may not need consent, that it would be okay in this case to mandate vaccination, even if people didn't consent. So in some jurisdictions, as many of you might know, the right to bodily integrity is not absolute. So unlike that very first view that Stark view I characterized, most people don't think that the right to bodily integrity is absolute. There are some cases in which the right to bodily integrity meets a threshold for its being abridged permissibly. Okay, now in Ontario, we have something called the Health Protection, sorry, that should be health, not Heath, the Health Protection and Promotion Act. It gives the medical officer of health quite significant powers, okay? Section 22 of this act is the most important for my purposes because it might give us some sense that actually the law, and maybe in line with that ethics, doesn't think that the right to bodily integrity is absolute, that it may be okay to abridge it in just the kind of case we find ourselves. Okay. So it says, this section 22, says that the medical officer of health, may require a person in respect of a communicable disease that is a virulent disease to place himself or herself or themselves forthwith under the care and treatment of a physician. Okay, that's pretty powerful. The medical officer of health may do this if a communicable disease is present, if it is a threat to public health, and the treatment is necessary to deal with the threat. For our purposes, it is important to note that the Act states explicitly that the Healthcare Consent Act of Ontario does not apply. The Healthcare Consent Act of Ontario says, among other things, that in order for treatment by a physician on a patient to be permissible, that physician must get the patient's consent. So that is, the treatment under the medical officer of health order does not require a patient's consent in order to be lawful. This suggests that at least in the law, under certain conditions like these ones here, communicable disease is present, threat to public health, etc., the right to bodily integrity is not absolute, right? That we think that there's some threshold at which it's permissible to override that right, right? Okay. Okay, this of course might not mean it's morally okay to violate bodily integrity, because maybe the law is an ass. It doesn't always line up with what we think we ought or should do, right? But I think it does give some evidence for at least my strong intuition that one's right to bodily integrity is not absolute. It may not involve the right to pose a threat to other people, a significant threat to other people. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Especially a threat that may, at least at some point, with a safe, effective, easy to take vaccine, be easily and safely avoidable. Okay. So what did I do here? Well, I put forward some arguments for why we might think about mandating vaccination. And of course, I want to be careful here. They don't necessarily entail that we ought to mandate vaccination, because whether or not we ought to mandate vaccination doesn't only depend on the kind of arguments I give, right? It depends on a wide variety of considerations and factors, right? Empirically speaking, we might find, right, that mandating vaccination may lead to a reduction in vaccination rates or damage public trust. That would be a strong reason not to mandate vaccination, right? But importantly, it wouldn't be as a result of the failure of philosophical arguments. It would be to do with considerations having to do with long-term effects of policies, right? So if it turned out that we frustrated our ability or our desire to have good or positive public health outcomes, or we damaged public trust in the medical profession, that might be a strong reason not to mandate vaccination. But that would be the reason, okay, right? Right, it just may be better to use some other mechanism to encourage individuals to vaccinate themselves. So my other colleague at Oxford, Julian Savulescu, said, look, you know, maybe I think mandatory vaccination for COVID-19 is permissible, but it's difficult. So maybe what we should do is we should start paying people to be vaccinated, right? So maybe the way to get people vaccinated is not to mandate it, but it's to give them some cash. Okay, maybe. Again, we have to figure this out, but whatever the case is, mandatory vaccination is not obviously worse than any other coercive measure. Not worse, obviously, than being told you can't visit your family or you can't go to your favorite hangouts, etc. So government should therefore at least consider making vaccination mandatory based on a comparison of the costs and benefits of the full range of available pandemic control measures. So the important point here is these is just one set of factors that I've pointed to. There are other factors, and the right way to make this decision is by looking at the costs and benefits of the full range of options open to you and selecting the one that seems, all things considered, best. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I hope I wasn't too wooden. I've not given a talk in this way before. Now I look forward to your penetrating and excellent questions.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Sorry, frog in my throat. For this great presentation. Thanks for helping us actually even think about those difficult situations where there are going to be difficult decisions to be made very soon. And so I think that was helpful to me anyway. So now we are going to move to the Q&A period. So if you have questions, I'm inviting you to write them in the Q&A. And so someone here in the background is going to send a question to me, and then I'm going to introduce the questions to Anthony. But maybe just starting with, before the questions start appearing, maybe starting with one question here that we had before the talk, actually, from DF. And so I think that question might force you maybe to acknowledge that, as you said, there are many factors going on here. And it seems that there are certain assumptions when you're making those arguments about making vaccination mandatory. And one of them is that we have enough vaccines for everyone. So the question here that came before the talk is, so the person is asking, I've read that vaccine distribution in low-income countries will be difficult due to lack of resources to keep the vaccines stored at required cold temperature and not enough personnel for distribution. So could mandating vaccines in countries like ours, like Canada, contribute to this problem and worsen global health inequities?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's really a question about whether we ought to do more for enabling other countries, in particular low-income countries, to achieve high rates of vaccination. So, I mean, typically what happens is big Western countries like ours that are wealthy buy up lots of vaccines, and that might leave it more difficult for less well-off countries to purchase the vaccines. And so they have, as a consequence, less good health outcomes than we do. So I think I heard this morning on the radio that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is giving significant millions of dollars to help low-income countries purchase vaccines and distribute them in their populations. But I do think it is really important that we do support low-income countries achieving high rates of vaccination. And actually, I would argue that given the inequity that exists, I think one of the things about the pandemic that's really kind of come out is that there are really deep and significant and serious inequities. Given these inequities, we probably should give ourselves lower priority in taking the vaccine over those other countries. I think if we had to choose, we should give them a significant opportunity before we buy vaccines. It's too late now, but we should anyway do that. You know, just because that's an important way in which we can discharge our obligations to, in particular, people living in low-income countries.
Yeah, thank you. So we have questions coming in now. The first one from Andre, who's asking, what can we learn from previous pandemics in this regard? Do you know, have you done a bit of research with regard to how we've dealt with mandatory vaccines or interventions in previous pandemics?
Sadly, I don't know the history of this. I probably should, and I think if I go further with this research, I will do that. I don't off the top of my head know whether or not in other pandemics there have been attempts to mandate vaccination or not. I know that certainly when there have been significant measles outbreaks, like for example in Italy and other places, that really has significantly increased people's enthusiasm for mandating vaccination, especially amongst children. And as I said before, there was quite a bit of enthusiasm initially for mandating vaccination in the spring. I think it was up around 70% of Canadians were saying they supported that. That's dropped now, but yeah, I imagine that as we you know, move on and you know, start to consider the ways in which, especially the long-term impacts of the coronavirus, that probably we will think more about you know, our enthusiasm for mandating vaccination or making vaccination something more appropriate.
Yeah, thanks. The next question is from Sheila, who asked about, let's say, the size of the problem. So would your argument be any different or change if we are dealing with a disease that is more regional instead of a pandemic where it's like global? So do you think that the same kind of arguments can be made if we're dealing with a problem that it's at, let's say, a smaller scale?
I mean, it may not be as compelling because the effects are not as great. It's hard to know. I mean, what the right thought is. I mean, I think if the you know, threat to public health is significant enough, even if it's confined, that still might give you strong reason to mandate against the background that people are not inclined to do it voluntarily. I mean, it may just be that voluntarily, you know, it leaves people, you know, motivated enough to take it. So there's not an issue.
Yeah, but the fact that it might, so even if it was going to affect a lot of people in one region, you don't necessarily think that would that might.
I don't think
change.
it would change the argument. So why would, you know? So what would be the reason for the change? I mean, it's about the threat to public health, and the need to try to achieve that herd immunity. If, you know, all things considered, mandating vaccination helps you achieve the herd immunity in that context, I don't see the problem. I mean, maybe the thought is, look, given that, you know, it's so widespread, that is COVID-19 is so widespread and the impact is so significant, you might think, look, you know, just the size of the cost, you know, makes it much more compelling. I mean, I suppose, yes, you know, as the costs of, you know, leaving people to voluntarily mandate, you know, are greater, you know, that gives you more reason not to let that be the way that people decide to get vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. So our next question from Peter. It says, you did mention the concept of social contract. So, and he wants to know any thoughts on how that is involved. So that, yeah, I agree. So it wasn't.
Did I mention the social contract?
Sorry, I don't quite remember. But
maybe I'm not sure. So it just, how is it involved? I mean, I suppose in one way you might think, look, yes, I suppose I hinted a little bit this. If we're going to have policies which are legitimate and which are, you know, justifiable, we need to have them be justified in ways that are agreeable to a wide range of people. So one of the things that characterizes society is deep and wide moral conflict. We'll have different ethical frameworks and views. Those come into conflict. It doesn't seem right to justify policies on the basis of some particular moral view, because that involves imposing a moral view on someone who may not accept it. So if we're going to be able to have policies that avoid that, we have to have ones that, you know, speak to widespread kind of values that you would accept, or you might come to accept, regardless of the sort of general framework that you endorse. So I think, you know, lots of people have talked about vulnerability, you know, in the context of the pandemic. So look, if that's a value that everybody shares, and that might play some role in the justification of mandating vaccination, that's an argument that might appeal to a broad number of people. Similarly, for the Douglas, Forsberg, and Pew view, look, if it's just true that it's, I mean, we don't know if this is true or not, but if people tended to accept the public health restrictions, despite the costs they imposed, and mandatory vaccination imposes a smaller cost, they might have some reason, given their support for the initial restrictions, to support this mandating of vaccination. So I take it that part of the benefit of those arguments is just that, you know, they appeal to a wide variety of people, despite their background frameworks, and you might get a kind of consensus on that might be like a sort of, you know, kind of, you know, I don't want to stretch this too far, but kind of contractualist form of justification, at least over a certain kind of policy. And of course, the sticking point is always going to be, to what extent do we agree with where the threshold is set for overriding people's bodily integrity, right? That's going to be, I think, the sticking feature. That's why I sort of was pointing to the law at the end, saying, look, we seem to already have given this power to the medical officer of health. So look, we seem to already accept it as part of our contract. Maybe, you know, of course, with all these arguments, someone might just say, well, look, we can go the other way and say, well, look, I don't agree with that. So, you know, let's, you know, reject the idea of mandating vaccination. And of course, I'm not sure I've given anything to suggest that that's not the right way to go.
Yeah. Good. So, whoops, sorry. Our next question here from Jacqueline. So, do you know why support for vaccination is lower now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic? Or do you remember what the study said or the reasons for this decline?
I didn't. So I just read, I mean, I read some polls, you know, as they came out since the beginning of the pandemic. I was quite surprised. I think, you know, initially, I think it was around May or so, to find that there was a high percentage of people who accepted that. Now, of course, you know, it's not, I don't know what questions were asked. So I don't know what the questioners were suggesting was meant by mandating. I mean, there are different ways in which you can mandate, right? You can have criminal sanctions. You can just have some, you know, small, you know, coercive element or non-voluntary element, whatever. I don't know what kind of question they're asked, but yes, it did sort of drop off. I'm not sure I know why that is. Maybe People have become skeptical of the fact that, vaccines have been developed so quickly. And so they're like, oh, well, maybe I would be in favor of ones that have taken, 4, 5, 6 years, or whatever many years it takes to develop a vaccine typically. But these ones that are going to be available within 6 or 8 months, I'm scared of those. But I'm pretty confident that these are amongst the vaccines that have been developed, probably the ones that have been subject to the greatest amount of scrutiny. And I think it's probably in anybody's prudential self-interest who develops one to make sure that they're safe and effective. And so, I think probably if those are the reasons for dropping in support for mandatory vaccination, then I don't think they're particularly good or compelling reasons. I mean, of course, we should always be skeptical of governmental interventions, especially those that involve intrusions in our bodies. But I'm, in this case, I'm not, at this point, I'm not super skeptical.
Yeah. Thank you. Our next question, we're shifting gear a little bit here, and someone who has a question about your way of using the law for moral intuition. So the question here, I'm going to read it, is from Hao Yang. So thanking you, by the way, for the talk. And so that person is curious, how can it be justified that we can draw some intuitions from the law? So yeah, I guess that refers to the move you made at some point, like looking at the law and suggesting that maybe the right to bodily integrity is not absolute, and even in the law, and then you use that as an argument in favor.
Yeah. So obviously, as I said, sometimes what the law has expressed or has as an element is not necessarily what's morally acceptable, and of course, vice versa. So I think one thought is that law might reflect a strong intuition we have, that there are going to be cases in which it might be permissible to override someone's bodily integrity, like where there's a public health threat, and taking the course that violates bodily integrity is one that's necessary. It's also got to be obviously proportional. But I take it probably, the law is, in this case, at least some kind of expression of the idea that, yes, there's a point at which individual rights give way to, socially valuable outcomes. I mean, yes, you can't, there's no easy transition, but I take it the law might reflect in some way that intuition in this kind of case.
Yeah. And maybe kind of related to that. So that's a question that came from Jessica, who was asking if you could talk more about the rights to bodily autonomy or integrity here, and why they might be given lower priority than other rights. So at some point you suggested that there were there are also rights to I can't remember the expression.
Right. So there's rights to
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, right to freedom of movement.
Freedom of movement, yes.
And association and things like that, yes. So I wasn't exactly sure what the question was.
So the question is more about, so you seem to suggest that in some situations you might be able to give a lower priority to
right.
to bodily integrity compared to other sort of rights, so that we can go and compare those things.
Right. Oh yeah. So the thought that Douglas, Forsberg, and Pugh had was that the same kinds of considerations that would justify infringing the right to freedom of movement would also justify infringements of the right to bodily integrity. And so one thought you might have, which I think they do some good work to dispute, is that they don't have the same threshold for when they can be defeated. That the right to bodily integrity is a more stringent right, taking more to defeat it than the right to freedom of movement. Now, I think they point out, which I think is quite plausible, that although that may be in general true, there may be cases in which it's actually harder to justify infringing the right to freedom of movement than it is to justify the right to bodily integrity. So if there's just a very small threat to your bodily integrity, that might be quite easy to justify. And so, it's a right that might be, under some considerations quite weak, and in some cases quite weak, other cases quite strong. So I think that was sort of the thought that I was expressing. But just one thought is just that the right to bodily integrity is kind of much more stringent than the right to freedom of association or movement. But there may be some cases in which that isn't true, right? So these are what they call graded rights, that they come in degrees, and the degree of stringency changes with the context and what's at stake.
Thank you. So one more question from Megan this time. And Megan's
Hi,
asking,
Megan.
If public agreeability to the vaccine drops below the accepted herd immunity rate, so let's suppose that people are fear or conspiracy theory, how might this strengthen or weaken the ethical concerns about mandated vaccination? Is that a statistic that should be considered seriously by governing bodies?
Okay, let me just read that. So, right. Well, so of course, it does affect the argument that you would give, because as I said at the end, it may be if certain kinds of beliefs, are behind why people don't want to be vaccinated, that mandating vaccination may harden those beliefs and frustrate the goal of producing that herd immunity, right? So I think it is going to affect it. So again, it depends on the kind of person you're dealing with. And of course, it's always best not to have to mandate something. It's always easier if you can sit down and chat with someone and explain your reasons and try to find ways to, get them to make the decision which you think is most favorable to public health outcomes. But yes, I think the kinds of beliefs that are present in why people don't get vaccinated, I think does make a really important difference to the justification of mandating vaccination. It may just be that, people are hardened in their beliefs, and that that's the reason they don't want to be vaccinated, and mandating vaccination just might frustrate that. Now, of course, one thing I didn't raise, and I think is worth raising, is that, look, if you don't want to be vaccinated, and it's really, really distressing to you, it's possible for there to be another option for you. Just, you have to stay home, right? I mean, there's, you can say, look, I don't want to be vaccinated, but there's a cost attached to that. So I think nobody thinks it's okay to just do whatever you want and be a public health menace. But maybe they don't want to be vaccinated either. But then the option is, well, you got to stay home. You got to, continue on with these, public health measures for as long as there's no threat, and that might be a long time, and might be difficult. And so that again brings us around to what are other options for producing good public health outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. That was a tricky question, actually. So a question now from Chris, and I guess that goes back to one of the remarks you made toward the end about paying people. So how do you feel about nudging citizens to vaccinate rather than trying to make reasoned case to justify the intervention? So this might be more effective as a policy, but how? And does this change the ethical issues?
So that's a great question. So I think, nudges are a legitimate public policy tool. Nudges are just things that involve not limiting people's choices, not limiting the range of things they can choose from, but changing the context, or what people call the architecture of the choice. So they change the context in which the choice is made, so that people as a consequence of how they're wired, choose the wise choices over the less wise ones. So I think, it's a tool that's worth thinking about using. Of course, people are worried about them undermining people's autonomy, because typically in these cases, what's happening is the choice architecture is being fashioned in such a way that it makes it likely that people will choose the right choices, but because they're susceptible to some kind of bias. So here's an example. People who work in institutions where they're able to choose whether to pay into the pension scheme or not, typically pay in when the default choice is that you pay in, and they don't pay in when the default choice is not paying in. So if the default is pay in, most people do, and that's of course the right sensible thing to do. But they're doing it because typically people just go with the default option. So I think there's certainly going to be worries about autonomy, worries about whether you're helping people over the long run make good choices. But I agree, it could be an effective tool, and maybe a more effective tool in this case than mandating vaccination outright.
Yeah. So the next question goes back a little bit to some of the earlier questions we had, where so in your argument you assume here that like the vaccines are going to be there, that they are that we're going to be able to distribute them, that they're going to be effective, and that there's going to be like maybe just one vaccine. But so here's the question from Jill is suggesting that some have suggested that new viruses may be an ongoing issue. So that there might be different strains. We're going to need multiple vaccines. We might going to need like multiple rounds and so on. There comes a point where there's lots of resources here involved. And so then the question is, does it perhaps make sense to focus our efforts on addressing the root causes and social inequalities making this pandemic so deadly? So we want to so there are two things maybe going on here, is that the resources we put and how we actually address the problem. And if there are multiple rounds and the vaccines become very costly, then there might be different ways of addressing issues here.
Yes, okay, so that's an excellent question. So I think you're always going to have these kinds of choices. So where, okay, so something's happened. Do I try to develop something to mitigate what's happened, or do I back up and deal with the systemic or root causes of these things? Typically, because going the first way is cheaper and more exciting and easier, we tend to do that. But I agree, this is an opportunity, I think, for us to think more about, well, what's the source of these viruses? Is it a consequence of human encroachment on animal habitat? And so bringing humans into closer contact with animals maybe they haven't been in contact with before. And so that presents an opportunity for the spread of these kinds of viruses and so on. So I think, probably, all things considered, it's not clear what the right thing to do is, but I would agree there's a strong presumption in favor of thinking, well, look, what we want to do here is not just mitigate the harm of what we're doing. We want to get behind the behavior and stop it from resulting, and so then stop it from producing these kinds of vaccines. But again, that's a very difficult a thing to do and difficult to convince people to do. And so that's, I think, often why we just take the routes where, okay, we'll get a vaccine and that's how we'll deal with it, as opposed to we should deal with encroachment on, animal habitat, bringing humans and animals closer together, making it possible for, there to be this transmission of this kind of virus. But I agree with you. This is a kind of common problem that happens in a lot of different contexts, and it's possible that we might need something more radical if you're right that vaccines are a kind of ongoing problem, or sorry, if viruses are an ongoing problem. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and I think that's so it's 8 o'clock, so that's it. You finished answering that question right at the end of the session. Thanks for the talk, thanks for all those good answers, and thank you everyone for your questions. So
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so we are going to have one last session next week, and the speaker next week is Manisha Deka, who's professor at the University of Victoria. And so I invite everyone to join us again next week. Thank you and good evening.